And now for a closer look at the conflict in the Middle East, we're joined today by Robert Lawrence, a professor of English and Turkic studies at Dongduk Women's University. Professor Lawrence, thanks for coming on today.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So, President Donald Trump says Washington will guide stranded ships through the Strait of Hormuz starting Monday. What do you make of the latest developments in the conflict?
All right, so the U.S. is framing this as a humanitarian gesture and a defensive mission to free ships that are stuck in the strait, not as an escort mission. And this comes right after the U.S. decided to reject Iran's latest 14-point proposal. So they're saying that this Project Freedom intends to free neutral ships that are victims of circumstances. There are about 20,000 sailors that have been stranded on ships for about 2 months. So I think what the U.S. is trying to do here is get some momentum going to break the impasse in the conflict. It's planting season right now, and the world has about 1 million metric tons of fertilizer that's stranded on ships in the region. So by framing this as a humanitarian gesture on behalf of the U.S., Middle Eastern countries, and in particular Iran, I think President Trump is probably trying to initiate some movement in the conflict and get all actors on board. Now, from an Iranian point of view, I don't think they're going to see this as a humanitarian gesture at all. The strait and the world's economy is their primary source of leverage. And this has been their strategy for a long time. So willingly giving up that leverage is counterintuitive. They've already said that any American interference with their new maritime regime on the strait will be considered a violation of the ceasefire. And Donald Trump has said any interference with Project Freedom will be dealt with forcefully. So this is set to begin Monday morning, Gulf Standard Time. And, the stakes are high and the likelihood of a return to kinetic warfare is also high.
Right, and the United States also says it'll withdraw 5,000 troops from Germany in the next 6 to 12 months. And President Donald Trump also said he would probably consider pulling American troops out of Italy and Spain. How do you view the Trump administration using troop deployments as leverage with its allies?
We'll have to see if this actually pans out in anything first, and we need to see kind of the causes of the dispute to see how serious it might be. With Germany, this seems to be a direct response to some public criticism coming from Chancellor Merz. With Italy and Spain, it's a reaction to their perceived lack of support for Operation Epic Fury, with both countries denying U.S. access to air bases and even airspace a couple of times. So, legally, the 2026 National Defense Authorization Act requires a minimum of 76,000 troops in Europe. And there are approximately 80,000 troops right now. So by law, if he removes more than 4,000 or 5,000 troops, he's going to need to have space for them to relocate somewhere on the continent to avoid falling below the required minimum. Additionally, there's already some pushback coming from both sides of the aisle domestically in the U.S. You have ranking opposition members and chairmen of both the House and Senate Armed Services Committee. They've publicly criticized this potential troop reduction. And this morning, I think there have been some diplomatic communications coming from Germany that kind of they're implying, an attempt to reconcile the differences between the two. So we'll see if anything actually comes from it. As far as my view on this type of diplomacy, I think coercive engagements against allies is probably a bad idea, and everyone involved could do better by focusing on the bigger picture and maintaining strategic discipline.
And this has been actually raising concerns here in South Korea about a possible drawdown of U.S. forces in Korea. So given, these developments, what implications do they have for South Korea's security strategy and its reliance on the U.S. alliance?
Rhetoric like this is bound to make U.S. allies wonder, where their standing is with the U.S. And it's especially tangible here in Korea because of the centrality of the role that the U.S. plays in security here on the peninsula. So, but the thing is that it's a different situation here. Before I mentioned the NDAA has set troop minimums for Europe. Well, that same legislation sets a minimum troop level of 28,500 for Korea and that's country specific. So these troops can't be moved around Asia, for example, like they can in Europe. So it's exponentially more difficult to unilaterally reduce troops here in Korea. But in order to prevent this, or reduce the possibility of this becoming a bigger issue, I think it's better that disagreements are handled privately and diplomatically, where communication is clear and one-line comments aren't rerouted and used as a wedge tactic against the alliance. The U.S.-ROK alliance is strong, it's institutionalized, and it's multifaceted. But in this time of social media, I think messaging in the information space is of the utmost importance, and people have to be careful in how they say what.
I see. And before I let you go, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth last week said North Korea's nuclear program offers a lesson to learn as he defended the U.S. operation against Iran. So how should we interpret that remark?
Well, I mean, he's arguing that the U.S. basically allowed the threat of conventional weapons to serve as a shield behind which the North developed its nuclear program. And now it's believed that North Korea has approximately 50 nuclear warheads, and it's very difficult to see how that would be reversed. There's some that hold on to the idea of denuclearization in the peninsula, but given what we've seen in Libya and the Ukraine, I would argue that it's fairly unlikely that the North will voluntarily give up such a powerful deterrent. So Secretary Hegseth is arguing that Iran is doing the same thing, and that's why the U.S. had to engage kinetically when it did. Iran's built a big missile program that can hold the region and, as we're seeing now, the world's economy hostage. And he's implying that for decades, it's continued to, involve itself in nuclear negotiations while simultaneously developing their own program in secret, just as the North did. So the lesson he's arguing that the U.S. must learn from the failure to prevent the North from getting a nuclear weapon is not to wait until it's too late, not to wait until Iran having a nuclear weapon is a fait accompli.
I see. All right, Professor Lawrence, thank you so much for your time and insight today. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.